This session is all about soil, and essentially it's about creating simple strategies to help you make the best possible soil that you can in your garden. Because really, in order to create a thriving edible garden, that's what we need to do. Without thriving soil, we can't support a thriving amount of diverse plants above. The plants that will grow without the thriving soil just won't have the resilience and the robustness to be able to fight off pest and disease, or be able to draw up all the nutrients to make the food as healthy as it possibly can. So we're going to go on a bit of a journey and look at what is good soil, and then simple ways that we can actually improve our soils that we have, starting from whatever it is that we are beginning with, because I understand there's people from all around the world taking this course, and we'll all have different types of soils, but these strategies are things that we can all do to make a really positive difference. So for me, I think the most important thing we need to focus on is that healthy soil is the basis for healthy food and therefore a healthy society. The real superfoods are the ones that you grow yourself in the best soil, because they're just so nutrient dense and so full of life. And so that's what really this whole kind of concept of a thriving garden is about, is creating thriving food and thriving health. So in summary, what we're going to be exploring is firstly thinking about what is good soil, knowing what good soil is and how to maybe feel what that soil is like. Also knowing how to feed the soil life, protect the soil structure and the soil life, and also to work with nature in the process of improving the soil. Now, even though I've mentioned that we're going to do simple strategies, it's not at all about simplifying the system. Actually, what we're wanting to do is to increase the complexity that we can as much as possible in simple ways. Simple systems are more vulnerable. Complex systems are far more robust and resilient, and that's what we want to do. So the basic approach that we're looking at in this course is about how to tend the soil, not to work it, to support it and to nurture and to nourish it, and to really help to build up that complexity and thriving nature of it. And it's full of life. There's actually far more life under our feet than there is completely above the level of the soil. It's this thriving and amazing world under there. But we have upset nature's balance in terms of all the clearing and the chemical use and industrial agriculture and urbanization. We've denatured our soils. We've caused massive amounts of erosion. Apparently, we're about 1% of the topsoil every year is lost to erosion, and about a third of our arable land on the planet has been lost so far due to erosion and pollution. It takes well over 100 years to create 1 centimetre of soil in a natural system, so this is a disastrous loss. And if you think about topsoil, it's this amazingly fragile layer. It's the edge between the atmosphere and our rocky core of the planet. It's this thin layer of life which enables all life to exist on this planet. So without our healthy topsoil, we can't grow food, and the plants can't grow, which provide oxygen, and so on and so forth. So in order to recreate nature's balance, we need to focus on cultivating complex polycultural systems where the soil is protected and fed. So basically in the sort of systems I'm talking about, you actually don't really see the soil. The soil is covered, it has plants all over it, it's fully mulched, and it's the soil life. That top layer is actually being fed and built on and nourished, and it's the topsoil is increasing rather than being depleted. So it's a regenerative approach to gardening, to farming, to growing food. And I grew up, the top picture up here is actually of the city where I grew up. It's Melbourne. When I was in high school, I was actually in a classroom when this dust storm engulfed our city and the whole city went dark. It was the most terrifying thing. And it was from that point back in the 1980s when, particularly where I come from, people started to sit up and talk a lot more about the impact that our society is having on the soil, and that we needed to start to care for the land. But we still have massive agriculture that is continuing to destroy and disrupt the soil life, using way too many chemicals, too much tilling of the soil. We allow the soil to be exposed to the elements, we're compacting the soil, and we're actually depleting organic matter out of the soil consistently. And without organic matter, that we can't have life in the soil, because that's what feeds it. So what is superb soil? Stop and think for a moment about the feel. Imagine yourself plunging your hands into the most beautiful soil that you can imagine. What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What is the structure of it? And what kind of life is in that? And you stop to think about all of that, and then look at the soil that you have, that you're working with, and you try and imagine how you can work from what you've got to what it needs to be. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So the feel of it, really, you think, so you don't want it to be too sandy or too clayey. It needs to be more crumbly and open structure, almost like a wrung out sponge, and quite soft in a way. And when you actually walk on the soil, you feel a sense that you're sinking into it. So actually try not to step on the soil once you start activating it, and have little pathways through, and not actually step on the soil that you're activating. But there's a sense of openness, and there's a sense of moisture that's held in that soil. The smell of the soil is just, it's that beautiful, rich, dark smell. It's almost kind of like a bit like a rich fruit cake. It's not at all, it's not smelly. It's not, you actually can inhale a great big nose full of it, and it's a beautiful, uplifting smell. You can even taste it if you want to, and a lot of farmers used to do this and still do, and every now and then too I'll be tempted to have a go at this, because when you taste it, you can taste to see whether there's it's slightly acidic or what's going on with it, and so the idea is that you get to know your soil, intuitively get to understand where it's at, what it needs, and you can feel with your hands and your feet. I love going out actually gardening barefoot, because I can feel with my feet with the temperature of the soil, how moist the soil is. I can feel how open the soil is, and you just don't seem to get that when you're out gardening with great big boots or gum boots on. And I know some people don't like to go out in bare feet, but for me it's a way of actually connecting. I can feel with the soil, feel with my feet whether the soil is the right temperature to start putting certain types of plants in. And once you start to connect at that level, you become part of your garden. It's more of a, you speak the language of your garden by being connected with your whole body. So the structure of the soil. Now, the thing is with good soil, with superb soil, is actually that the soil life sets up the structure. It's not something that you do, something nature does, and you can't do it any better than how nature does it. So I tend to encourage people to leave alone, to add materials on the top, and to allow the soil life to take the materials down into the soil and to structure it how they'd like to organize it. And that way you're going to get the most perfect way for it to be set up and for it to be as live as possible. The thing that is really important is to make sure that we keep feeding the soil. And with that, I mean, compost and organic matter, all the things that the soil needs to stay healthy and to keep proliferating and to actually feed the plants. And so what is a live soil? I mean, often I hear, have people talking about soil as dirt. Dirt, I imagine this thing that's, it's dead. Dirt, dead, it's dry. Soil is alive. It's a living system, actually. It's within just 1 teaspoon of soil. There's this whole world in there. There's 1 billion bacteria and fungal filaments everywhere, thousands of protozoa and nematodes. And there's these tiny things. You can't see them. I mean, as well as that, you have worms and other little beetles and all sorts of things, ants going on in this tiny little bit of soil. Now, nematodes, I just wanted to point out this, often when you hear people talking about nematodes, you hear them talking about it in a negative way, that, the root knot nematodes are affecting my plants. What I found is that by feeding the soil and activating the soil and bringing the soil to life, the good nematodes, the friendly nematodes, will actually fight off the nematodes which are affecting your plants. So the nematodes which are affecting your plants are really just an indicator that you need to feed your soil, that your soil is not alive enough. So rather than coming in and going, okay, I have a problem, I'm going to do something about, I'm going to attack that particular point, you go to war on the nematodes. What you do is it's a more peaceful way of gardening, and it's sort of saying, okay, well, what do I need to add into the system to bring it back into balance? And it really is about finding that balance all the time. Now, another really important thing that we need to talk about with soil, and I've got a separate little presentation later on about this. This is about the internet of the underground. This is the fungal filaments that extend throughout the soil, connecting the plants and giving them access to more nutrients and more moisture. When I was growing up, I learnt that, plants accessed nutrients with their roots. Well, it's actually these fungal filaments that give them far more access to it than anything else. I also learnt that, you had the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. Well, the whole kingdom of fungus is way much huger than anything else that we can possibly imagine, and we're really only just starting to understand this. So I just wanted to put this in here now, briefly, to let you know about this and to sort of define. So mycelium are those long white fibers of fungus that grow on organic matter in a web-like network. And if you lift up a log or some woody mulch, you'll see them. They're those little fine white filaments of like these fungal threads that extend through, and they're actually decomposers, but they're connecting everything up. There's this sort of communication that's going on between them. Now, that's the ecologically active part of fungus, but when you get those joining and coming together, you get a flowering, and that's when you see the fungus, the mushrooms that come up on top. But actually what's going on underneath is extraordinarily huge. It's actually one of the largest living things on earth is a network of fungus underneath the soil. Now, mycorrhiza is actually the symbiotic relationship between fungus and the plant roots. And it's this bit that's fascinating and so interesting and so important to understand in terms of making superb soil. So it's the mycorrhizal fungal filaments, these white hyphae that are really extensions of root systems. So as roots go down into the soil, what happens is that they go to a certain point, and then from there, these fungal filaments keep extending out into the soil, collecting nutrients and water, and it's far more effective at collecting those for the plants than the roots are themselves. Mycorrhizal fungal filaments are in the soil, and they're really very much the extensions of root systems. So the roots go to a certain point, and then after that, these extend down deeper and wider, collecting nutrients and moisture and bringing them back up into the plants. Without that, they would just have, such a huge fraction less of their capacity to access nutrient water. If you think about it like this, so the roots are like the arteries and the veins in our body, and the fungal filaments are actually the capillaries. So they're the fine things that go to every single corner. They pick up all the details and go right far into the soil, collecting as much as they possibly can. Now, the thing which makes all of this work is organic matter. So organic matter matters. The amount of organic matter that you have in your soil is critical. And as much as you can put in, the better. Really, we have depleted our organic matter in soils through the type of land management that we have, and through clearing and through industrial agricultural systems and urbanization, as I mentioned. So we need to put organic matter back in. If you think about how land used to be with forests and all of that material falling down on the soil, continuously feeding the soil, when we clear all of that away, the soil no longer has its source of food. So in order to bring it back to life again, we need to either recreate forest systems, food forest systems that are self-mulching, or we need to be able to keep adding in that organic matter, either through mulching, through composting, and also through no-till methods, because the more that we till the soil, the more we expose and deplete the organic matter in the soil. Things like cover crops are also hugely beneficial because they act like living mulch and increase organic matter. So organic matter is really something that you need to focus on in terms of increasing it, and when you're trying to get a system started, but also as you're trying to maintain a system to keep feeding it. So we'll talk more about that too. So the first thing really is about trying to add as much mulch and to cover the soil. There's actually no place in my garden where I'm growing food that is not covered with mulch or a living mulch. And this is really important because whenever we expose the soil to the sun or to heavy rain or to wind, we get erosion and loss of nutrients. And this then impacts the life that's in the soil. The soil life diminishes when it's exposed to too many elements, and then the soil structure diminishes, and also we get a loss of soil moisture. Not only from the lack of life in it, but also from the evaporation. So really, unless you're in a spot where you're just trying to get an extra heat to warm up the soil when you're just getting started out of winter, in Australia, pretty much we do mulching throughout the year, except right in the very cooler spots, and you need to heat up the soil and warm it up. But then after that, mulch it and really try and create a garden where you're not actually seeing the soil. The soil is protected. One of the things I really love to do is chop and drop, and it's such a simple and easy and effective way of increasing organic matter. Now, not only is it increasing organic matter that's going to be drawn into the soil, it's also providing lots of habitat for lizards and other insects, which are going to help you in managing your system. So it creates habitat, it creates organic matter for the soil, it protects the soil, and it's a really easy way to do it. For example, I have this section in my garden where I was growing corn. The corn finished, I dropped the corn down onto the soil and I planted broad beans through that. The broad beans have come up, they've all finished, now I've dropped that back on and now I'm planting again through that. And so each time some plant has finished, it actually helps to replenish the soil where it is. And so this cycle goes on. So it's not constantly taking things away from the soil, it's actually constantly adding into the soil. What this picture is here that you're looking at behind it is when the pumpkins had finished. So instead of pulling all the pumpkin material away and taking it up to the compost bays and processing it up there and moving things around from site to site, I really love the idea of keeping materials where they are. So the pumpkin has grown in this spot and it's died, it's finished its life cycle, and it goes back into the soil. And you can start to see over on the right how the sweet potato is starting to creep over the top of that. And then that will die back and then the pumpkins will take over. And so you get this constant adding into the soil through the chop and drop. So that's just on the ground level. It's also important to think about adding in all different sorts of layers of plants that you can use to cut and add into the soil. And I have a section on this a little bit later on in about mulch, where you can read more about this. And as we get more into the further sections, I'll come back to this again because it's a really important point. Now, cover crops, really this is about creating living mulch. In the main sort of salad vegetable garden areas, I use a lot of just the local grass hay from the local farmer. But up in the food forest areas or in the broader zones, I mostly rely on living mulch. And living mulch, it acts as mulch, but it also is a food crop and it's a habitat. And as you can see, this is the sweet potato here. It helps to collect water and it provides homes for frogs and all different sorts of things. So living mulch is a fabulous way of constantly growing your own material. Now, because if you keep on importing mulch into your site, it can become quite costly, and there's also the risk you can take of importing weed seeds. Whereas when you're growing your own mulch, you're in charge of that. You know that it's chemical free. You can be in control whether it's weed free. It's free and it's accessible, and it's constantly adding more and more into the soil. So that kind of concept of creating abundance in the soil, but also in the plant material and food that you have, living mulches and or cover crops, you can call them whichever, a really important strategy. We can't talk about soil without talking about compost. Compost is the food for soil life, and it's natural and it's free when you make it at home. And so I encourage you to make as much as you possibly can. If there's nothing else you get out of this course than to make lots of compost, I think that is a really huge benefit, because everything in your garden will benefit from having compost and natural fertility built into your food system. So compost will attract worms. It helps to improve the structure of the soil. It improves the texture of the soil. It helps to neutralize your pH. The more compost we have within the soil, it helps to hold more moisture in the soil and also retain more nutrients. So it basically brings the whole system alive. And as plants grow and you harvest, you're actually taking the nutrients and taking the moisture and taking the organic matter out of the soil. So you need to keep adding it. So having compost systems available that enable you to keep replenishing your soil is really important. Now, green manures can be considered to be like a in situ compost, where you grow plants, quite often legumes, but also a mix of legumes and other sort of biomass type plants. You allow them to grow up, and before they really flower and seed, you chop them back and allow them to decompose right there on site. Now, I like this because, again, it's this idea of not having to sort of take something from one spot to another spot. It makes everything work right where it's needed. Now, green manures with the legumes are actually helping to fix nitrogen in the soil. And this picture on the side, you can see this little pinky nodule. That's actually a nodule of where the legume plant is storing nitrogen in the soil. So you know that if that's pink, when you slice it open like that, it's pink, you know it's fixing nitrogen. You need to have a rhizobium relationship. So you need to inoculate legumes before you plant them to make sure that they are fixing nitrogen and putting nitrogen into the soil. There's two different ways that people do green manuring. Some people suggest that you actually, once it's grown up, you dig it into the top of the soil and allow it to compost there. But there's another theory too, which is actually just to slash it back and allow it to decompose on the soil. So you get two things there. The first one is that the materials that you've chopped back on the top become a mulch, and you're not actually exposing the soil to the elements, and you're actually protecting them and adding more material and organic matter on the top. The other thing is that as the roots decompose in the soil, they're adding material there and opening up channels, and you're actually not disturbing the system that the soil life has created underneath, or the fungal filaments. You're actually maintaining that. So I would recommend with the green manures to grow them, but then just chop them and plant into them, or do more mulching over the top of them. So there's compost, cover crops, green manures, and worms. worm farming is just such a fantastic thing for improving the quality of our soil. And it's when we add worm castings into the soil, it helps to bring the whole soil life alive. It's great food for the soil and it's great food for the plants. One of the simplest ways of doing this is worm towers, which I'll talk about in a minute. But worm farming is also a really simple way, and it's very common. Many people have these types of worm farms that you can see here on the right. I call them the worm apartment style worm farms, where there's layers. The top layer you're feeding the material into. The second layer has material that's just finishing off and getting ready for you to use. The worms are coming out of that and going into the top section, and the bottom tray is collecting the liquid, which you can see at the top here gets drained out. And I use this liquid to water all my vegetables and increase their vitality. And when I feed my worms, typically I wrap up the food scraps in newspaper, and that then helps to create that carbon and nitrogen balance. It also helps to stop little flies from coming in and landing on it. But with the lid, and if you have the little vents on the side, you shouldn't get too much of a problem with flies at all, which is why I recommend that for food scraps, worm farming is the ideal. Really, if you try and put food scraps into open composting systems, you're just attracting insects or rodents or dogs or whatever into that system, and it quite often is a very ineffectual way of actually processing the food scraps. So mostly all my food scraps go into worm farms, and I also use compost bins too, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the worm tower is essentially a pipe that's embedded into the soil. I put it about 40 centimetres into the soil with holes so that the worms can take the material out into the soil around it. But mostly what I find is that the compost worms, stay in the tube. When it's warm, they'll go down below the level of the ground, and when it's warm, when it's nighttime, they'll come up into the tube and eat the food scraps that you've placed in the top of the worm tower. And so what happens? This is kind of like a point from which you are activating the soil life. And these points I put all the way through my garden. Maybe every 2 or 3 meters I have a worm tower. And every few days I'll go to another worm tower and put some food in that one and keep moving my way around the garden. So you never have to actually handle the worm castings. They're just going straight into the soil, and the soil life that exists in the soil, the other worms, the earthworms and other soil organisms, are coming in and taking that material and spreading it out from that point. And it just is such an easy way. Now, you can use this in the middle of a raised garden bed, and we even use smaller versions embedded in the middle of large pots. And I recommend, though, having several of these around in your garden because, particularly if you've got a family of 3 or 4, that there's not enough there's not enough space in them to process all of your food scraps. So a few of them spread throughout your site will enable you to process most of your food scraps. Now, coffee grounds is something that's superbly accessible in most urban environments and most towns as well. Or if you're a coffee drinker, you probably produce enough coffee to add into your compost material. Now, there's a couple of things that I wanted to say about coffee grounds. One is that they're fabulous for improving your compost. They're great food for worms, and they help to improve the soil structure. So I do a couple of different things. One is I add coffee grounds up to about 25% coffee grounds in worm farms and worm towers. I also add coffee grounds into my compost and mix it through in there. Now, I don't actually put coffee grounds straight on the soil. I've seen it recommended that, you just put it around your pots, and I find it goes moldy and quite smelly. But when it's actually mixed through a compost or added into a worm farm, it's fabulous, and it's a really good soil improver. So coffee grounds add in lots of nitrogen and also organic matter. So it's a very accessible type of material that, most cafes actually would throw away about, 50 kilos of this a week. And if it goes straight to landfill, it just ends up becoming a waste and something that will end up off-gassing methane. Whereas what we want to do is actually get it back into the soil, to feeding the soil and improving what we have. And it's a waste product that can be turned around. Some people are also using this to grow mushrooms, and it's a fantastic medium for that. So it's really important to think about what are the wastes that you can find in your environment, or what are the abundances that you can find in your environment, and find a way to return them back into the soil. And just one last thing on the coffee grounds is that there's also a myth that it makes the soil more acid. Actually, after you've processed your coffee grounds and run water through them and extracted the coffee, the main coffee from them, the drink, the pH actually is far more neutral than it is before you've done that. And I've done some tests. Actually, my homeschooling son did some tests on the pre-used coffee and then the coffee after it was used, and found that it's actually about 6.5. Ours was. If you might want to do your own test to see too. But it's an interesting thing to see how you can find ways to use all these different resources that are available to you. Really, a waste is only a food that's in the wrong place. We should be able to find ways that we can use all the different wastes that we find in society. And if we can't, then maybe we should think about not using them. Another thing I really love to use in my garden is these liquid teas made from plants that I grow. Now, the comfrey tea is a way of actually accessing a high nitrogen fertilizer for your garden without having access to manure. So if you're in an urban environment or a suburban, or even in a homesteady type environment, maybe you don't have enough manures, using comfrey is a way to really boost that up. So one of the simplest ways that I do this is by harvesting lots of the comfrey leaves, submerging them in water and allowing it to ferment for 6 weeks, giving it regular stir, and then I use the liquid of that. And that's what I use to water around the garden, and it really boosts the plants. And the sludge that I pull out of the bottom goes into the compost and helps to activate it. So I keep a brew of this going all the time. I'll talk more about comfrey tea too in a section below. So if you want to find more out about that, there's more details in a further section. Bokashi is a type of effective microorganism. It's a way of speeding up the composting process and activating soil life. What you can do with this material is, you can see in the picture on the top there's a type of bran, typically wheat bran or rice bran, which is infused with effective microorganisms, positive active bacteria and yeast, which help to kind of like pickle or ferment your food scraps. So what you do is you start to fill up your bucket. It can just be any old lidded bucket, it doesn't have to be a special Bokashi bucket. You can put a bit of food scraps in, sprinkle a little bit on the top and press down the material so there's no air in it, and then put the lid on. And the next day when you come along, you put in more food scraps, sprinkle a little bit more Bokashi on top until it's full. When it's full, you leave it for about 7 days, and at that time it's fermented. And when you dig that into the soil, it will very rapidly turn into beautiful humus soil food. Now, the thing about this is it actually doesn't biodegrade into sort of that rich dark compost that you think of in terms of composting systems and worm farms. It takes materials, food scrap materials, and turns them into that. You can leave that bucket with the lid on for 6 months, come back, and you will still find identifiable vegetables in there. It's just pickled it, nothing else. Now, so really it's kind of like a pre-composting system. So why use it, you ask? Well, there's a couple of reasons that I really, really like it. Firstly is the bottom point here. It actually stops the food scraps from smelling. So I have a compost caddy that I keep in my kitchen, and I always put my food scraps in there every day and until it's full, and then I take it out to put in the compost. Now in summertime, it can really get a bit poggy. If I use a teaspoon of the Bokashi bran every time I put some materials in there, it doesn't smell. And I can even leave it in the sunniest spot in the kitchen or out in the veranda with the sun shining on it, and it won't smell. It changes the chemical composition of the food scraps, and it actually ends up smelling quite sweet. It's remarkable. It's absolutely amazing. Now, the other thing that I really like about using Bokashi is that you can put all different sorts of things in there that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. So if you want to add in dairy or meat or citrus or all those other sorts of things, this is where you can use it. So a lot of times people have been throwing out food scraps because they don't know what to do with it. They think, you can't add it into a compost system. Well, using this you can. Then once it's all pickled, you can either, like I said before, you can either dig it into the soil for it to decompose there in the soil, or you can add it into your compost bin. So either way, or into a worm farm. If you have one of the specialised Bokashi buckets, it has a little tap on the bottom, and each few days you can drain off the liquid and use that as a fertiliser. It's quite a powerful fertiliser. The thing is, you have to make sure that you keep draining that off regularly, otherwise it starts to really get smelly. Interestingly, if you don't have this sort of mesh and the separation of the liquid, if you allow just that liquid to stay in with the materials, it doesn't smell. So I've changed from having these bucket systems to simply having a bucket with a lid and just using that straight. And I highly recommend getting this too. Now the Bokashi, you need to buy the bag of bran. There are instructions on YouTube how you can make your own, but it's not that expensive to get a bag, and it lasts for a really long time. And you don't need to go and buy one of the specialized Bokashi bins. Like I said, just a simple bucket with a lid, could be like a little compost caddy or even a nappy bucket or something like that, is enough for you to do what you need to do with the Bokashi. Now, another really important point about the soil is that you need to, once you start to activate and to open up the soil, it's really important to stay off it, not to step on it, not to walk where you're doing the work. So I have lots of little pathways everywhere in the garden, and these pathways, you can see where my daughter's standing just there doing some gardening. It's what I call a little keyhole path, and that pathway actually doubles as a water harvesting path. I always have little keyhole pathways like this. So as the rain falls, it runs down the side, across the contour pathways into these little keyhole pathways, and acts like a soak. So it's a self-watering garden when it's raining, which really helps a lot. And particularly if you have a lot of organic matter in the soil, instead of water running off, you're actually sending it into your garden. And because the soil has a lot of organic matter in it, it can absorb more moisture. And also with the mulch on top, it then also helps you to maintain as much moisture in the soil too. So whether you have little stepping stones or little pathways, and so having areas that are sort of permanent beds as opposed to just sections that you're walking in various spots. But the key thing is stay off the soil that you're really trying to cultivate and live, because if you step on it, you can feel it. It just sinks below, and I have a sinking feeling if I happen to do that. I think, oh my gosh, I've just squished all the air and life out of that particular part of soil. So to help it, stay off the soil, and also try and do as much no-dig gardening as possible. Now, I will be talking about how to set up a no-dig garden system in another section next week. But for me, this whole idea of actually having no-till gardens that are covering and protecting the soil life, adding organic matter into it, and making sure that all the materials that you're adding are connecting into the soil and building up. Now, no dig gardens, no till gardens are really where you need to focus to get the best soil life happening. Now, it's a really important thing to think about how you can integrate animals back into a vegetable or fruit growing system, because it's the separation of animals and horticulture which has created a lot of pollution and the need for a lot of inputs of fertilizers and various things into agricultural systems. The best way to grow things is as an integrated way. So chickens, in my system, I don't have a really large garden, so chickens are about the biggest livestock that I've got happening. And they are really important in terms of adding manure into the system, for processing food scraps, for pre-mixing compost for me. What I do is I throw a whole lot of mulch and hay materials and chop and drop materials from the garden into the chicken pen. They scratch around through that and they add manure into it. And when it's looking like it's sort of starting to break down a bit, I rake it out of the chicken pen directly into a compost bay that's next to the chicken pen, and then that's that 3-bay composting system that I rotate that, and I get beautiful compost straight out of that. So the chickens are super helpers in terms of preparing compost, getting the first stage happening. An awesome way too of turning food scraps into protein. And I'm just talking about the eggs there, not even the meat. You can feed your chickens a whole lot of food scraps and bits of materials from around the garden, and they pick off insects and do great jobs, and they turn all of that into fabulous food and fabulous compost. So if you can, find a way to integrate chickens into your system. I know in some of the really smaller gardens it's difficult, but if you have a suburban backyard in just a small coop with a handful of chickens, they will add an enormous amount of value into your system. And another thing that's a really important thing to consider when thinking about creating superb soils is the idea of creating perennial systems, deep-rooted perennial systems. The more we focus on annual gardening, where we're constantly tilling and planting and pulling out plants and tilling and that sort of cycle is constantly disrupting the soil life. Whereas if we plant deep-rooted perennial gardens, then with a lot of self-seeding annuals that will go back into the soil, what that's doing is actually constantly improving the soil and not disturbing the soil structure. So a focus on that perennialization of our food gardens, creating edible vegetable garden systems that are more like a kind of a food forest. It's really exciting to think that once you've got your soil alive and thriving and open, it becomes receptive soil. So whenever your plants, your annuals, start to seed, the soil will start to hold those seeds, and when the time is right, when the moisture is right and the temperature is right, those seeds will sprout. And so your soil becomes your seed bank. And it's an amazing thing once you get to that point of soil aliveness and soil openness that can happen. And it's also a great way, to be able to create little seed balls. And we've often, with the kids too, we've made seed balls of different things. So, wildflower seed balls or annual herb seed balls or edible flower seed balls or salad green seed balls. And we mix up seeds in with a bit of compost and a bit of clay, and we toss them around in the garden where we want a bit of a wildness patch to happen. And when when the environment is right, those seeds will sprout, and so they sit there as these sort of dormant potential habitats and food. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to really build up your soil capacity to receive seeds and to receive things like these seed ball gifts, and then to surprise you with abundance. And of course, the more we focus on this approach to gardening, the more it's a safe garden. You know, for me, with young children in the garden, it is important to be able to know that they are safe, that, you know, they can go out and they can garden wherever they feel they'd like to, and they can eat whatever they feel they would like to out of the garden, and it's completely safe. So there's no chemicals or pesticides or fungicides or anything there that's going to be harmful to them being in the garden, or also consuming food that's not safe. So just as a review, this approach is really about getting to know your soil and getting the feel of the soil, and so you can start to improve it and to monitor it and observe it and be present in your garden and focusing on the soil, getting your hands in the soil regularly or getting your feet on the soil. And then getting into the practice of constantly feeding and protecting your soil. So you're not thinking about feeding the plants, you're thinking about feeding the soil, because the soil is going to feed your plants. So you want to protect your soil, feed your soil, and work with the natural cycles. So the key strategies that I've talked about here are getting a lot of mulch happening, doing a lot of chopping and dropping, adding in a compost system. Now, compost tractor is coming up soon, and I'll talk about that. That's actually moving a compost bin around the site. Integrating chickens if you can, and having the chicken and compost system connected. One of the really important things about this type of gardening too is about creating relationships between the different elements in the garden. It's not just having chickens over here and compost somewhere else. It's actually finding ways to connect all the pieces together. Integrate as many different worm farms and worm towers as you can, and really focus on improving your soil through no-till methods such as no-dig gardens.